In this video, I'll be talking to you about derailleur gears, how they work, how to set them up, how to get them working, how to make the most of the gears. Now, why do we have gears in our bikes? It's to make cycling easier. It's to make sure that when we get a nice cadence, which is a nice speed, nice comfortable pedalling rate, that we maintain that no matter what the terrain may bring. So if there's a hill or it gets wet and gravelly and it slows us down a little bit, we can change our gears to maintain that speed and keep pedalling nice and easily. If we come to a really big steep hill, we can go down to a really low gear and get up the hill. Much like the car has gears, you don't want the engine labouring and really struggling or really revving really hard. We, the engine, and we need to change our gears to maintain our exercise rate and our cadence. So that's why we have gears. So I think it's important before we start messing around with the gears and getting them set up that we understand how they work. And I've got a few diagrams to hopefully help with that. So the first one shows us what the gear combinations are, and it shows us that on this particular bike here, we have 3 gears on the front, 1, 2, 3, and they're controlled by the shifter on the left. And on the rear, we have 8 gears, and we have those controlled by the shifter on the right hand side. Now this one is the lowest gear. That means that you pedal really, really fast, but it's nice and easy if you come to a hill. And this is the highest gear. And on the rear, it's the flip side of that, driver and driven. So we have a low gear here, which is the biggest one, and the high gear here, which is the smallest gear, which is confusing. Smallest one's highest. Now let's forget all about the front ones for now. And in this video, we're going to talk about the rears. We'll cover front gears in another video. Front gears are kind of getting phased out a little bit now as we get more and more gears on the rear here and a bigger range. The need for 3 gears on the front here isn't as high now. So we tend to be losing a few. First we dropped to 2 gears, and now we're down to some like 1 and then 11 on the back or something like that. So, but for this video, we're going to talk about bikes that have front gears and rear gears, but we're going to concentrate on the rear gears this particular time. So, before we go any further, it's good to check compatibility. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, some bikes have been built out of parts over the years, or they've had bits and bobs swapped over, or you may buy it second hand and you don't realise that it's had bits swapped over until it's too late. The majority of gears will work with each other, and it's worth noting on your bike which gears you've got. Now I know that this rear derailleur is a Shimano, and I know that the shifter on the bike is also a Shimano because it says on there, and it says 7-speed. Now look at this bike, and I can count these gears here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's got 7. So this bike has actually been either changed or has originally came as a 7-speed. The diagram showed us an 8, but that was just for demonstration purposes anyway. So you can see that this bike is a 7-speed, so it's got a 7-speed shifter and it's got a 7-speed derailleur. It's a Shimano derailleur. It actually says on their index, so we know that it works with Shimano index system. It's got Shimano cog and it's got 7 cogs, so we know that straight away that should work, but we shouldn't be clicking thinking why doesn't that work. It's worth noting the brand Shimano because you can get other brands as well, one of which called SRAM. They don't work together. So if you've got a SRAM shifter and a Shimano derailleur, the chances are you'll struggle with the indexing, which is every time you click the button, 1 gear changes. The pull rate on a SRAM and a Shimano is slightly different, and by pull rate I mean how much cable is pulled every time you click the button. So the first couple of gears usually work okay, but then after that it starts making rattling noises and jumping and things because the spacing isn't correct. So it's important to check that compatibility first. Once you're happy with that, you need to make sure you've got the correct chain. What do I mean by chain? I'll show you. Here's some notes here that are very basic, and there is a little bit of crossover, but as a rule of thumb, basically, single speed bikes or hub gear bikes have one particular type of chain. 5, 6, 7, 8 speed, this is a 7, if it was an 8 it'd be fine. Use the same sort of chain as well. 9 speed has its own chain. 10 speed has its own chain, and 11 speed has its own chain. So again, it's worth noting that when you're checking for these things, check that you've got the right chain on. I did a bike once that I was struggling to get indexing, and it was because it was a 10-speed block, but it had a 9-speed chain, and that means the chain was very, very slightly wider. So when you were clicking the gears, it was just to say catching. So the first few gears were okay, but after that it ran out, and it was making a racket, and it just wouldn't index in for me. So again, it's worth checking that. How do you check it? If it says narrow on the chain, narrow usually means one of these. And if it's riding okay, the chances are that's right. So if it's narrow, it's a 5, 6, 7, 8. If it's a chain that's independent, so a 9, 10, 11, 12, it should stay on the chain, 9 speed, 10 speed, whatever it is, on each link individually. If you're buying a new chain, then just buy the correct chain for the bike. Phone the bike shop, I've got a 10 speed, I need a chain. That's the easiest way of doing it. So we've talked about derailleur gears and the fact that they're on the rear of the bike and on the front of the bike, so we're going to talk about the rear. So, I'll just actually take that down a second. So I've made a little diagram on how the gears work. Really simple. Now this little fella here goes backwards and forwards and moves the chain onto the gear that you want as per what you ask the shifter to do. And it also tensions the chain, so it keeps the chain nice and tight. If the chain's too long, it'll hang down, or if the chain, there's something wrong with the derailleur, it may hang down there because the derailleur is broken or damaged. So again, make sure that's nice and tight, and if you're unsure, get it checked out. So this moves backwards and forwards and changes the gears as per the movement on the shifter. And what a lot of time people do is that when you click the shifter, each click you make changes one gear. And what happens is people think, oh, the gears aren't quite right, they're not tuned in correctly. So they'll take a screwdriver and they'll twiddle with these screws until they find out, oh, well, it's a bit better, and then they'll leave it alone. In actual fact, those screws don't do anything. Not as far as the indexing goes anyway. Those screws are kind of bump stops. If you think of them as movable walls, you can move backwards and forwards. And what they do is they limit how far the derailleur can go. They limit its bandwidth, if you like. And what do I mean by that? Well, in this diagram here, you can see I've drawn the rear cassette. So this cassette, this here, is this cog. I think it's quite a good drawing. This little fella here is a derailleur, which I'm going to substitute with my pen. And these two here are the screws. So we've got the low screw controlling the biggest ring and the high screw controlling the lowest ring. Now what happens is, as you wind the screws in, it limits how far this can move. So at the moment, it can move a little bit too far. What do you think would happen there? The chain will come off. And again, it can move a little bit too far, the chain could come off that way. So what this does is this sets the derailleur for the bike in the first place. So it makes sure that the derailleur is set straight and also that it doesn't go too far either side. So if we wind that screw in a little bit on both sides, so we wind the high for this side and the low for that side, we then could hit a stop either side to stop the chain from coming off. So if you push the lever just that little bit too far, it saves the chain jumping over and hitting the spokes. So it's important before you do anything, disconnect the cable if the cable's on there. If the cable's snapped, then don't worry about it. Get the derailleur set first. Now there is a tool for checking that the derailleur is straight. If this has taken a knock, it can bend. But what tends to happen is you have something called a derailleur hanger, which I've got several of here. And these little fellas are made out of aluminium. And they bolt onto your frame and carry the derailleur. And they're made out of aluminium for a reason. And they're a little bit thinner too. Because what's meant to happen is if you hit that with some force, it snaps that. Rather than damaging your frame, it snaps this. And then you can buy another one of these for about £10, £15. Put it back on and your frame's okay again. You haven't broken your frame. If you imagine snapping the lug off, then you would never be able to put the derailleur back on again. So the idea is that these break and are replaceable. If they bend very, very slightly, you can persuade them a little bit, and there is actually a tool specifically for the job. While we're speaking of tools, you just take a look at my table here. These are the tools that you need to join in today. This is a derailleur hanger alignment tool. And what happens with that is you take the derailleur off, that screws in its place like that, and you can measure it against the frame that it's straight. It's really big, so people tend to just give it a little to straighten the derailleurs up. But again, if the hanger snaps, you've lost nothing really. It was always bent anyway, so that's what that tool's for. But again, you don't need that unless this is really bent. All I would do is have a look down and make sure that this derailleur cog here that you can see my finger on is in line with the highest gear, which is the smallest cog. So I'm going to take the screwdriver and I'm going to wind in the screw that says high. It'll have a little H on it, and if I wind it in too far, it will actually knock it out of alignment. So it's actually changed gear there, it's actually jumped up one gear because I've wound that screw in too far. So now what I need to do is wind that screw out a little bit while I'm pedalling to try and get that to come back down. Hear the noise? There we go. Oh, it's trying. There we go. There we go. So I will set that derailleur perfect so that it's nice and straight and you can see down the line that it's nice and straight. I'll post a picture of it now. Right, so that's the high screw dealt with. How do we deal with the low screw? There's only one way to do it really, and that is to ask the derailleur nicely with your fingers to go onto the top gear. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the derailleur to sit up here and not much further. So if you remember back to our diagram, what we do is we will actually use our thumb to push this derailleur across so that the chain goes in that gear, and then we'll just try to push it a little bit further. If it goes, we've already established the chain will come off, so what we need to do is make sure that it doesn't come off. So we wind that screw in with our Phillips screwdriver until it hits this, stops it from going any further, but allows it to go into the first gear and nothing more. So be very careful with your fingers for this one. So I'm going to hold the back of the derailleur here with my fingers, and I'm going to push the part that moves backwards and forwards. I'm just going to pedal and just ask the derailleur nicely. You can see it's going up the gears there. There. Now I can see, I don't know if the camera will pick it up, I think you probably will, the chain's going too far. Already it's trying to go into that sport guard, which is what it's there for really. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just put a little turn. I'm going to tighten that low screw a little bit more and see what happens. Now it's dropped onto the cog there, so I'm happy that that's roughly somewhere near. If you pushed it over and pedalled it and it didn't go to the first gear, the screw's in too far, so wind it out very slightly. Again, that should be nice and lined up, which this one is. I'll post a picture of it for you to see now. There you go. Okay, so I'm happy now that that derailleur is set. I've checked that it's straight. I've checked that all the spring and the tension's okay, the chain's okay, we know it's the right chain, we know it's the correct amount of gears, the correct derailleur and the correct shifter, so you know that it's good to go. The line you're looking for that I've been talking about, that I've just posted some pictures for, I can actually demonstrate here with this chain. So on this cog here, what you're looking for is a nice straight line. If the chain's getting pushed or pulled like that, it's going to try and change gear, because that's how it works. The derailleur just pushes the chain over and makes it change gear. So you're looking for a nice straight line on the gear. I will do a separate video about changing a chain and setting it to length, should you need to do it. Sometimes people change the chain, they change the gears, the gear cables, sorry, and they obviously reset them all. So it's usually good practice, so I can do that. And if you're doing that, and if you're thinking of doing that, you'll need to get yourself one of these, which is a chain tool. Doesn't have to be a big fancy one, but you can get a nice chain tool for about 5 or 6 quid usually. Online probably even cheaper at the moment. So if you're going to change a chain, then you make sure you get the right one, as I've mentioned already, depending on how many gears you've got, and get yourself a chain tool, and I'll do a video later. So back to the gears. I'm not going to labour on about how to change the cable, because I've already done cables on brakes, and brake cables are very similar. The changing the actual inner cable or making the outer cables up is all the same. Just make sure that you've got the correct cable, because gear cable is 4mm, not 5. And the inner cable, which can be seen here, is slightly different. So there's the gear cable that you want. Don't confuse it with the road bike brake cable. This is the one that you want. So we're going to stick a new cable in, but how do you do that? Well, Google is your friend, I'm afraid. There's so many different shifters available and so many different ways of putting cables in that you really need to know what shifter you've got before you can start. Now, as a rule, thumb shift gears tend to be the easiest to change. So for instance, I've got a couple here. So this one, which is the same as the one that's on this bike conveniently, has the shifter integrated in the brake lever. So there's the brake lever and there's the gears on the top. So you've got one at the bottom and one at the top there. On these ones, you take off this plastic cover using these two little screws, and inside you'll see where the cable sits, and you can just pull the cable back out again and put the new one in. On this shifter here, which you still get some very similar, you'll see again this is integrated into the brake lever. It doesn't have to be, it can be separate, but again this is a two-way thumb shifter, and on this one you can see that there's actually a hole at the back there and the cable feeds in. Sometimes there's a little plastic like grub screw in there that's got a cross head on it, and you unscrew that and the cable goes in through the back of there. These are popular ones, grip shift, but these are actually quite a decent grip shift, and these ones you peel back the rubber and the cable threads in through there. Those ones aren't too bad to do. These ones on the other hand are quite difficult, and this one you can see you have to take the handle grip off and this is left behind, and you can see the cable actually sits in the end, threads around inside and comes out of there. Very difficult to change those ones, and they actually, you pull them apart. Some of the other ones where they're just plain black, they're the same. You take the grip off and you've got to pop the grip apart, the shifter apart to change the cable, which are quite difficult, and it's probably, if you haven't done one before, I would probably recommend getting that done at a bike shop because they are difficult to change. The ones that are a dream to change are these ones, these old like 80s thumb shifters that are great because you can actually see the cable just threads in there, dead easy, threads around the shifter, and then they sit on the top of the handlebars. So when a bike like this comes in, they're a dream to change because they're really easy. These are really good for explaining how the SIS system works as well, which is Shimano index system. Again, indexing is the click, 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 click for every gear. So on this, because this is a 5-speed shifter, it's got 4 clicks. What? No, that's right. Because one of them is just a rest position. So the 5th gear is just a rest position. So then you've got 4, 3, 2, 1. So if it's a 5-speed shift, it's got 4 clicks. If it's a 6-speed, it's got 5 clicks, and vice versa. It's worth noting that some bikes, some of the older bikes, don't have an indexing system. They just have what's called a friction lever, which is, I've got one here, where you just move it and there's no clicks. So setting the bump screws on these type of shifters are very, very important because it's very, very easy to push past the clicks and send the derailleur into the chain. So it's very important to get these ones set absolutely bang on. But there's no indexing to worry about on these. You literally just, and you listen and you get the gear somewhere near, and that's the gear that you want. But a lot on older bikes, those. So as I mentioned, the gear cable is very similar to fitting a brake cable. And how is that? Well, when you pull a brake, what you do is you pull a certain amount of cable through depending on how much you want the brake on. So if you want the brake on really hard, you really pull the lever, you pull a lot of cable through and you pull a lot of brake onto the rim. If you only want to slow down slightly, you just touch it a little bit. If you think about it, what the gears are doing, they're exactly the same thing. They're moving and pulling cable through. The only difference being is that the amount of cable pulled through is regulated by this little fella and the little ratchet mechanism inside. So you don't have to worry about how much do I move it to get into that gear, or how much do I have to move it to pull the brake on really hard, because this takes care of that for you. So it's important to get the cable tension correct, because if you don't, that's when you have a problem with the clicks. A little tip, if you put the cable in, make sure it's in the highest gear. It has to be in the highest gear. So on this one it will be a number 5. You put the cable in, and that's because this derailleur is in the highest gear. So on this particular bike it will be in number 7, which I can see on here it's on number 7. If you put it on when it's on number 3, you've only got 2 clicks left on the shift and you've got no gears left on the back. So I'm going to get the cable, just quickly thread that through. Again, if you need to look at replacing cables and maintaining cables, that sort of thing, have a look on one of my previous videos and you'll see where I talk about brake cables and just sort of like cutting them to length and the cable ends, all that sort of stuff. That applies to your brake gear cables in exactly the same way. So I'm just going to quickly thread this one through here rather than labouring on too much about what I'm doing, because I appreciate it's quite a complex subject and the video could take us quite a while. Now all I'm doing there is just make sure that the cable's sat down by just pull on that cable and just moving the shifter. Remember to put it back in the highest setting before you carry on. So I'm quickly just threading this cable through here. Now the tools that I put in the picture, I won't need all of them, but you may. And I can see on this derailleur that this is a 9mm spanner. So the cable that holds this is a 9mm. Now the same way as I do the brakes, I always say, put your adjuster halfway out, because that allows us to knock off a bit of tension if there's a little bit too much, and the same way also allows us to put a little bit more tension on if it's not enough. Remember, the indexing system depends upon the tension on this cable. We don't touch the adjustment screws anymore, we forget about them now, they've done their job. Another good tip is if you've got a front derailleur, put it in the middle gear. It keeps everything aligned, dead in the centre, and it lets you just set those gears a little bit easier. So, I'm going to just connect this cable up. Always have a look at where your original cable is if you are putting a new one on, as the derailleur positioning for the cables can vary. What looks like a little tab to put the cable under on this particular derailleur isn't. It stops the washer from spinning around, and if you put the cable under it, it slowly releases itself as you ride along the road. So, I think that's going to be maybe a little bit too slack, but we'll see. So I've nipped that up, that's in 7, that's on 7, so let's give it a go. Right, if you click it once, it doesn't change gear, stop. There's no point going any further, because if the first gear is wrong, they're all going to be wrong. So you must get your first gear dead set first. When I say your first gear change set correctly first. Once that's right, the others will drop in. You don't have to mess about then. So again, what I'm looking for is for this derailleur to be nice and straight on the next gear, which it is. I'll put a photograph of that for you to see now. So, because that's in a nice position, the rest of the gears should just drop in as well, because it's made its change perfectly to the centre. You want that chain to sit in the centre of every gear. So let's try the next one. That's gone up. Next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. Now that's gone perfect first time. What was the chances of that? Well, let's check it on its way down as well. Every click should change one gear. That's worked really well. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and slacken the cable off a little bit to show you what may have happened if I hadn't got the cable tension right. So that's as slack as I can do it now. There. Now the first click hasn't done anything. I can hear it trying, because if you remember on this little comment I showed you earlier, what it's doing is it's pushing that chain across, but not quite far enough. Oops, sorry. It's pushing that chain across, but not quite far enough. So it's just to say touching the side of the next gear. It can't quite make it. So what do? We put a bit more tension on to get it to go in. So because I've got to stand back and pedal it at the same time, and just turn that a little bit. You can hear it. There we go. Now again, refer to the picture I just posted earlier, that gear needs to be nice and lined up in the centre of that chain, and really need to be all in line. If they're not, the next gear will be a bit noisy, and then the one after that will be even noisier, and the one after that might not even make it. So I'm going to make sure that I've got that in the right position. And that's it, guys, done. So because I've put a new cable on, I'm going to snip that off, and of course I would put a cable end on the end of there like I did in the brakes video. So, I hope that's made gears a little bit easier to understand for you. If you've got any questions, drop us a comment, and if I can help you I will do. The next video I'll address the front gears, and I'll also do a video about chain replacement, because that can be quite confusing as well. But as I say, I can't stress enough, make sure you get the right chain. If you get the wrong chain, the chances are the bike will work, but the gears won't be as smooth as this one, and you probably won't get them all. So that's it for now, guys. As I say, anything you want us to have a look at, if there's something I can show you, then drop me a line, drop me a comment. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.